The predator and the blind, he had lived 347 years. In that time, Dimitri Volkov had watched empires crumble to dust. He had seen kingdoms rise from mud and collapse into ash. He had drunk from the veins of thousands, nobles, peasants, warriors, lovers, and felt nothing but the hollow satisfaction of hunger temporarily sated. Power was his language. Silence was his throne. The castle that bore his name sat perched on the edge of the frozen realm, a monument to his dominion. Black stone carved from mountains that had forgotten the sun. Towers that pierced the winter sky like accusing fingers. And within those walls, he ruled with the weight of centuries pressing down on every decision, every breath, every moment of his immortal existence. But tonight, he was bored. That was the only word for it. Bored. A creature who had exhausted every pleasure, every conquest, every dark desire that 3 centuries could offer. He had seduced queens. He had broken generals. He had turned enemies into servants, and servants into dust. And yet, as he descended the stone staircase into the underground chamber where the auction was being held, he felt nothing but the familiar ache of emptiness. The air was thick with the scent of fear and desperation. The underground chamber was a cathedral of human suffering. Torches flickered against damp stone walls, casting dancing shadows that made the cages look like they were breathing. The smell of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and something darker, the metallic tongue of blood, hung heavy in the air. Dimitri's nostrils flared slightly. Even after 3 centuries, the scent of blood was a language his body understood. Around him, men in expensive furs and dark wool gathered like vultures. Predators all but of a different breed. They hunted for profit, for pleasure, for the simple satisfaction of owning something that had once been free. Dimitri hunted because it was what he was. Because the alternative, feeling nothing at all, was a death he could not die. Gentlemen, the auctioneer's voice cracked through the chamber, thin and reedy. Our next lot, a rare acquisition, young, healthy, completely untouched. The crowd stirred. Dimitri remained motionless, his dark eyes fixed on the stage where a figure was being led forward by chains. She was small, impossibly small. Her frame was delicate, almost fragile, wrapped in a threadbare gray dress that hung from her shoulders like a shroud. Her hair was long and dark, falling in waves down her back, but it was her eyes that made the crowd go silent. They were white, completely white. Milky, unseeing, the eyes of someone who had never known light. Blind. The auctioneer's smile widened. Blind from birth, gentlemen. Completely dependent, completely obedient. She will never see your face, never know your identity, never be able to escape. Perfect for those who value discretion. A ripple of dark laughter moved through the crowd. Dimitri felt nothing. This was beneath him. A blind servant girl sold like cattle. It was the kind of transaction that happened in the shadows of the world, the kind of cruelty that humans inflicted on each other with such casual efficiency. He had come to the auction out of habit, out of the vague hope that something, anything, might pierce the fog of his immortal ennui. This was not it. He turned to leave. Wait. The voice stopped him. It was soft. Impossibly soft, like fresh cotton, like the whisper of wind through winter branches. It came from the stage, from the blind girl, and it was directed at him, only at him. Dimitri turned back slowly. The girl's head was tilted slightly, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Her white eyes were fixed in his direction, but not at him. Through him, past him, as if she could see something in the space behind his eyes that he himself could not perceive. You, she said, her voice steady and clear. The one in the back. The one who smells like centuries. The chamber went silent. Every eye turned toward Dimitri. The auctioneer's smile faltered. The other predators shifted uncomfortably, sensing something they did not understand. Dimitri's jaw tightened. In 347 years, no one had ever addressed him directly at an auction. No one dared. And certainly no one, blind or otherwise, had ever spoken to him with such certainty. "What did you say?" His voice was low, cutting, like a scalpel through silk. The girl's lips curved into a smile. It was not a smile of fear. It was not a smile of submission. It was a smile of recognition. "I said," she repeated, her white eyes still fixed on that space behind his eyes, "that you smell like centuries, like old blood and older sins, like a man who has forgotten what it means to be alive." She paused. "But I remember." The words hung in the air like a blade suspended above water, waiting to fall. Dimitri felt something shift in his chest, something he had not felt in 347 years. It was not desire. It was not hunger. It was something far more dangerous. It was curiosity. "How much?" he asked the auctioneer, his voice still low, still controlled, but with an edge that made the smaller man flinch. Your Majesty," the auctioneer stammered. She is not. How much?" The auctioneer named a price. It was absurd. It was insulting. Dimitri paid it without negotiation, without hesitation, without taking his eyes off the blind girl on the stage. As the chains were removed from her wrists, as she was led down from the platform toward him, she tilted her head again, as if listening to the sound of his heartbeat, a sound that had not existed for 3 centuries. When she was close enough to touch, she reached out her small hand and placed it against his chest. Her fingers were warm, impossibly warm. "Welcome home," she whispered, and her voice carried the weight of centuries. "You didn't buy me, Dimitri Volkov. I bought you. Dominion and surrender." The carriage moved through the frozen night like a predator stalking wounded prey. Dimitri sat across from her, his body perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on the space where she sat. The blind girl, he still did not know her name, had her head tilted slightly as if listening to the rhythm of the carriage wheels against the frozen ground. Her small hands were folded in her lap. Her white eyes stared at nothing and everything simultaneously. The silence between them was not empty. It was pregnant with something ancient and dangerous. "You have not asked my name," she said, her voice cutting through the darkness like a blade through silk. "No," Dimitri replied, his tone flat, controlled. "I have not. Does it not interest you?" He leaned forward slightly, his movements deliberate, predatory. "Names are for people who have futures. You are my property now. Your name is irrelevant." She smiled. It was a small smile, barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Is that what you tell yourself?" she asked. "That I am your property? That you have dominion over me?" The carriage lurched over a frozen rut in the road. She did not flinch. Her balance was perfect, as if she had anticipated the movement before it happened. "I paid for you," Dimitri said, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. "That makes you mine." "You paid for a blind servant girl," she corrected, tilting her head in that unsettling way. "But that is not what I am. That is not what I have ever been." Dimitri's jaw tightened. In 347 years no one had contradicted him. No one dared. And yet this small, fragile creature, wrapped in a threadbare dress, was speaking to him as if they were equals, as if she held some knowledge that gave her power over him. It should have infuriated him. Instead, it intrigued him. "Then what are you?" he asked, leaning back into the shadows of the carriage. "If not a servant, if not my property, what are you?" She turned her head toward him, and for a moment her white eyes seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. "I am the reason you cannot sleep," she said softly. "I am the reason you have felt empty for the last 50 years. I am the reason you came to that auction tonight, hoping that something, anything, would make you feel alive again." Dimitri's breath caught. It was imperceptible, barely a ripple in the surface of his control, but she heard it. Of course she heard it. How do you know that? His voice was no longer controlled. It was sharp, dangerous. The voice of a predator who had just realized the prey was not prey at all. Because I have always known you, she said. In every life, in every century, I have always known you. The carriage pulled to a stop. They had arrived at the castle. The castle was a monument to isolation and power. Black stone rose from the frozen earth like the bones of some ancient, slaughtered god. Towers pierced the winter sky. Windows were dark, empty, like the eye sockets of a skull. The wind howled through the parapets, a sound like the screams of the damned. Dimitri led her through the main entrance, his hand gripping her elbow with enough force to communicate dominance, but not enough to cause pain. She moved with him effortlessly, as if she had walked these halls 1,000 times before. The servants scattered as they passed. They knew better than to stare at the master when he was in this mood. The air around him crackled with something dark and volatile. He took her to the east wing, to a suite of rooms that had been prepared for her arrival. A fire crackled in the hearth. Candles flickered against the stone walls. The bed was enormous, draped in heavy velvet the color of dried blood. "This is your room," he said, his voice clipped, efficient. "You will remain here unless I summon you. You will not leave this wing. You will not speak to the servants. You will not—" "I will do exactly as I please," she interrupted, her voice calm and steady. "And you will allow it." Dimitri's eyes flashed red for a moment, a sign of his rage, a sign of the predator beneath the human mask. He moved toward her with inhuman speed, backing her against the stone wall. His hand came up to her throat, not squeezing, but present, a promise of what he could do. "You are testing me," he said, his voice a low growl. "That is a mistake." She did not flinch. She did not tremble. She simply tilted her head back, exposing the delicate curve of her neck, and smiled. "I am not testing you," she whispered. "I am reminding you." And then she reached up, her small hand moving with absolute certainty, and placed her palm against his chest. Where his heart should have been beating, there was only silence. The silence of 347 years of undeath. The silence of a creature who had forgotten what it meant to be alive. But under her touch, something shifted. It was not a heartbeat. It was something deeper, something older. It was as if she were reaching into the void where his humanity used to live and pulling it toward the surface. Dimitri gasped, an involuntary sound, a sound he had not made in centuries. He pulled away from her, his hand falling to his side. His breathing was ragged, uncontrolled. "What are you doing to me?" he demanded. "Waking you up," she said simply. "Just like I promised." The night stretched on in silence. Dimitri did not leave the east wing. He told himself it was because he needed to ensure she did not escape. He told himself it was because he needed to understand what she was, what she wanted, how she knew the things she knew. He did not tell himself the truth, that he could not bear to leave her presence. He sat in a chair by the fire, watching her as she moved through the room with the grace of someone who could see perfectly. She ran her fingers along the stone walls, tracing the mortar between the blocks. She moved to the window and tilted her face toward the glass, as if she could feel the cold radiating from the frozen night beyond. "Tell me about the last 50 years, she said, not turning to face him. "Tell me about the emptiness." "No," Dimitri replied, his voice hard. "Tell me about the women you brought to this castle," she continued, as if he had not spoken. "Tell me about how you tried to fill the void with their bodies, their blood, their screams. Tell me about how none of it worked." "Enough," he said, rising from the chair. She turned to face him then, her white eyes fixed on that space behind his eyes where his soul used to live. "You have been waiting for me," she said. "For 50 years you have been waiting. And now I am here. And you do not know whether to worship me or destroy me." Dimitri crossed the room in 3 strides. He gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging into the thin fabric of her dress. He wanted to shake her. He wanted to demand answers. He wanted to bite her, to taste her blood, to understand what she was made of. Instead, he found himself pulling her close. His forehead came down to rest against hers. His breathing was ragged. His control was slipping, fracturing like ice under the weight of spring. "Who are you?" he whispered. "I am the woman you loved in another life," she whispered back. "I am the woman you betrayed. I am the woman who cursed you to 347 years of solitude. And I am the woman who has come to collect her debt." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her white eyes burning with something that was not quite human. "But first," she said, "you are going to remember what it means to love me. You are going to remember what it means to need someone. And then, when you are completely, utterly dependent on me, when you cannot imagine a single moment without my presence." She paused. "Then I will destroy you." Secrets written in blood. 3 days had passed since she arrived at the castle. 3 days of silence that was not silence. 3 days of a presence that filled every room, every corridor, every shadow of the vast stone fortress. Dimitri had not slept. Sleep was a luxury he had abandoned centuries ago, but now it was something else entirely. It was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her white eyes staring at him with the weight of centuries behind them. He found himself watching her. It was not the watching of a predator observing prey. It was something far more dangerous. It was the watching of a man trying to solve an equation that defied all logic. She moved through the castle as if she had lived there her entire life. She knew where the servants kept the fresh water. She knew which floorboards creaked and which ones did not. She knew the exact moment he entered a room, even when he moved with inhuman silence. On the third night, he found her in the library. The library was his sanctuary, a vast circular chamber with shelves that rose 3 stories high, filled with books in languages that most of the world had forgotten. Candlelight flickered against the leather spines. The air smelled of old paper, dust, and something else. Something that made his predatory senses sharpen. She was standing before a shelf, her small hand running along the spines of ancient texts. Her white eyes were closed, as if she were reading through touch alone. When she sensed his presence, she did not turn around. "You kept them," she said softly. "All these years. You kept every book I ever gave you." Dimitri's breath caught. It was a small thing, barely perceptible, but she heard it. "How do you know about those books?" His voice was low, dangerous, the voice of a man whose control was beginning to fracture. She turned to face him, and in the candlelight, her white eyes seemed to glow with an inner luminescence. "Because I gave them to you," she said, "in another life, in another time, when you were still capable of reading something other than the fear in a dying man's eyes." She reached up and pulled a book from the shelf. It was ancient, bound in leather so old it had turned the color of dried blood. The spine was unmarked, but when she opened it, Dimitri saw his own handwriting on the first page. Dimitri Volkov. Anno Domini 1679. The date was impossible. He had been turned in 1679. He had been a human then, a man with a name and a life and a future that had been stolen from him in a single night of blood and fire. "That is not possible," he said, but his voice was hollow. He knew it was possible. He could feel the truth of it resonating in the space where his heart should have been beating. She turned the pages slowly, and with each page, Dimitri saw more of his own handwriting. Passages in Russian. Passages in languages he had not spoken in centuries. Passages that describe things only he could know. His childhood, his mother's face. The exact moment he realized he was no longer human. And scattered throughout the margins, in a different handwriting, delicate, precise, beautiful, were responses. Answers to questions he had written. Corrections to his memories. Additions to his understanding. It was a conversation spanning centuries, written in the margins of a single book. "What is your name?" Dimitri demanded, crossing the library in 3 strides. He gripped her shoulders, not gently. "Tell me your name." She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw something in her white eyes that was not certainty. It was fear. It was ancient, bone-deep fear. "If I tell you my name," she whispered, "you will remember everything." And if you remember everything, you will understand what you did to me. And if you understand what you did to me, you will beg for death. And I am not ready to let you die yet. Tell me, he commanded, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of 347 years. She closed her eyes. Seraphina, she said, and the name hung in the air like a blade suspended above water. My name is Seraphina, and you loved me once. You loved me so completely that when you betrayed me, it broke something in the universe itself. The name was a key that unlocked 1,000 doors. Memories came flooding back, not in a gentle trickle, but in a violent torrent. Dimitri staggered backward, his hand coming up to his head as if he could physically hold back the tide of recollection. Seraphina, he saw her as she had been in 1679, young, radiant, with eyes that were not white, but a deep, luminous gold. She had been a healer in a small village in the Northern Territories. She had saved his life when he was dying of a fever. She had sat by his bedside for 3 days and 3 nights, her cool hands on his burning forehead, whispering prayers in a language that predated Christianity. He had fallen in love with her in that moment. He had loved her with the desperate intensity of a man who had never known love before. He had promised her forever. He had promised her eternity. He had promised her that nothing in the world would ever separate them. And then he had met Katerina. Katerina was a vampire, ancient, powerful, beautiful in the way that only the damned can be beautiful. She had come to the village hunting, and she had found him instead. She had seduced him with promises of power, of immortality, of a life beyond the constraints of human mortality. He had chosen her. He had left Seraphina without explanation. He had allowed himself to be turned, to be transformed into a creature of the night. And when Seraphina had come looking for him, when she had found him in Katerina's arms, he had not even looked at her. He had simply turned away. The curse had come 3 days later. Seraphina had been a healer, but she was also something else, something older. Something that predated the very concept of vampires and werewolves. She had cursed him with her dying breath, not to death, but to something far worse. She had cursed him to 347 years of solitude. She had cursed him to feel nothing but hunger. She had cursed him to watch everyone he loved wither and die while he remained, unchanging, eternal, alone. And then she had cursed herself. She had cursed herself to be reborn blind, stripped of her power, forced to live as a human in a world that had forgotten her. She had cursed herself to search for him across centuries, across lifetimes, until she found him again. And when she found him, she would make him remember. She would make him suffer as she had suffered. And then, when he was completely broken, when he had nothing left but the memory of his betrayal, she would take her revenge. Dimitri fell to his knees. It was not a gesture of submission. It was a gesture of a man whose entire understanding of reality had just been shattered. His hands gripped the stone floor, and for the first time in 347 years, tears fell from his eyes. Seraphina, he whispered, and the name was a prayer and a curse and a confession all at once. She stood above him, her small frame silhouetted against the candlelight. Her white eyes were fixed on his face, and in them he could see the reflection of his own damnation. "Do you remember now?" she asked softly. "Do you remember what you took from me?" "I remember," he said, his voice breaking. "I remember everything." "Good," she said, and her voice carried the weight of centuries of suffering. "Because now the real punishment begins." She reached down and placed her hand on his head, her fingers threading through his dark hair. It was a gesture that could have been tender. It could have been forgiving. But there was nothing tender in her touch. There was only the cold certainty of a woman who had waited 347 years for this moment. "You will love me again," she whispered. "You will love me with the same desperation you loved me before. You will need me. You will crave my presence like you crave blood. You will beg me to stay, to never leave, to forgive you for what you did." She paused, and her white eyes seemed to burn with an inner fire. "And then, when you are completely, utterly dependent on me, when you cannot imagine a single moment without my presence, I will take it all away. I will take your immortality. I will take your power. I will take your very existence. And you will finally understand what it means to lose everything." Dimitri looked up at her, and in that moment he understood the full scope of his damnation. She was not here to destroy him quickly. She was here to destroy him slowly, methodically, with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of someone who had nothing but time. And the most terrifying part was this: he deserved it. The eyes that know everything, the morning light filtered through the castle windows like blood through gauze. Dimitri had not slept. He had spent the entire night in the library, reading the margins of that ancient book, tracing the conversation that had spanned centuries. Every word was a knife wound. Every passage was a confession of his own cruelty. Serafina had left him there, alone. It was a calculated cruelty, leaving him with the evidence of his betrayal, forcing him to confront the magnitude of what he had done. She understood him perfectly. She always had. That was the most terrifying part. When dawn broke, he found her in the conservatory. The conservatory was a glass cathedral attached to the eastern wing of the castle. Inside, despite the frozen world beyond the glass, plants grew in defiant abundance: roses, orchids, jasmine, flowers that should not have survived in this frozen realm. Yet they thrived. The air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of earth and growing things. Serafina stood in the center of this garden, her small frame silhouetted against the pale morning light. Her white eyes were closed. Her hands were extended, palms up, as if she were receiving a benediction from the sun itself. "You've been awake all night," she said without opening her eyes. "Reading, remembering, suffering. How do you know?" Dimitri asked, though he already knew the answer. She always knew. "Because I can feel your pain," she said simply. "It radiates from you like heat from a dying fire. I have always been able to feel it, even when you could not feel it yourself." She opened her white eyes and turned toward him. In the morning light, they seemed to glow with an otherworldly luminescence. "Come here," she commanded. Dimitri obeyed. He had no choice. The command was not spoken with force, but with the absolute certainty of someone who knew that he would comply. He crossed the conservatory, his footsteps silent on the stone floor, until he stood before her. She reached up and placed her small hands on either side of his face. Her touch was warm, almost burning. Her white eyes stared directly into his, and for a moment he felt as if she could see, not just his face, but the entirety of his soul. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" she asked softly. "No," he whispered. "I see a man who is afraid," she said. "I see a man who has spent 347 years running from the moment he betrayed me. I see a man who has tried to fill the void with blood and power and conquest, but nothing has ever been enough. Because the void was never about hunger. It was about guilt." She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something he could not hear. "I see a man whose heart stopped beating the moment he chose Katerina over me. And I see a man who is terrified that I will never forgive him, because he knows he does not deserve forgiveness." Dimitri's jaw tightened. "If you can see all of that, then you know that I am beyond redemption, perhaps," she said, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "But that is not why I am here." She released his face and turned away from him, walking deeper into the conservatory. The plants seemed to lean toward her as she passed, as if drawn by some invisible force. "Do you know what blindness really is?" she asked, running her fingers along the petals of a white rose. "Most people think it is the absence of sight, but that is a shallow understanding. True blindness is the inability to see what is right in front of you. True blindness is choosing not to see." She paused, and her white eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the glass walls of the conservatory. "When I was reborn blind, I thought it was a punishment," she continued. I thought the universe was mocking me, taking away my sight as punishment for my curse. But I was wrong. My blindness was a gift. It forced me to develop other senses. It forced me to see in ways that sighted people never could. She turned back to face him, and there was something ancient and terrible in her expression. I can see your aura, Dimitri. I can see the color of your soul. I can see the exact moment your heart stops beating and the exact moment it tries to start again. I can see the future written in the lines of your face. And I can see the past written in the scars on your hands. She walked toward him slowly, deliberately, like a predator stalking wounded prey. I can see that you loved me once, she whispered, and I can see that you are beginning to love me again, and I can see that it terrifies you more than death ever could. Dimitri stepped backward, but she followed, closing the distance between them with each step. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice rough with emotion. "I want you to remember," she said. "I want you to remember what it felt like to love someone more than you loved yourself. I want you to remember what it felt like to need someone so desperately that the thought of losing them was worse than any physical pain." She reached out and placed her hand over his heart. "And I want you to feel this," she whispered. "I want you to feel your heart trying to beat again. I want you to feel the moment you realize that you are no longer a god. You're just a man, a broken, guilty, desperate man who is completely at my mercy." Under her touch, something shifted in his chest. It was not a heartbeat, it was something deeper. It was as if she were reaching into the void where his humanity used to live and pulling it toward the surface, inch by agonizing inch. Dimitri gasped, a sound of pain and something else, something that might have been hope or might have been despair. He could not tell the difference anymore. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why not just kill me and be done with it?" Seraphine's white eyes seemed to burn with an inner fire. "Because death would be mercy," she said, "and you do not deserve mercy. You deserve to live. You deserve to feel everything you made me feel. You deserve to love me with every fiber of your being, knowing that I will eventually destroy you." She pulled her hand away. And the moment her touch left his chest, he felt the void return. The emptiness was so profound, so absolute, that he nearly fell to his knees. "This is your punishment," she whispered. "Not death, not pain, but the knowledge that you are completely, utterly dependent on my presence. That without me, you are nothing. That I am the only thing that makes you feel alive." She turned and walked away, deeper into the conservatory, leaving him standing alone in the morning light. "And the cruelest part," she called back over her shoulder, "is that you will thank me for it." The days that followed were a descent into madness. Dimitri found himself following her through the castle like a ghost haunting the living. When she was in the library, he was in the library. When she moved to the conservatory, he moved to the conservatory. When she sat by the fire in the great hall, he sat in the shadows, watching her, unable to look away. The servants whispered. They had never seen their master behave this way. The great vampire king, reduced to following a blind servant girl like a dog on an invisible leash. But Dimitri did not care what they thought. He was beginning to understand the true nature of his curse. It was not the 347 years of solitude. It was not the hunger that could never be satisfied. It was this desperate, consuming need for her presence. One evening he found her in the music room. The music room was a place he had not entered in decades. It was filled with instruments that no one played anymore. A grand piano, a harp, violins, cellos. Dust covered every surface. The air was stale and cold. Serafina sat at the piano, her small hands poised above the keys. Her white eyes were closed, and then she began to play. The music that poured from the piano was not modern. It was ancient, complex, filled with a sorrow so profound that it seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. It was the music of loss. It was the music of betrayal. It was the music of a woman who had waited 347 years for revenge. Dimitri stood in the doorway, unable to move, unable to breathe. The music wrapped around him like chains, binding him, holding him captive. When she finished, the silence that followed was absolute. "Do you remember this song?" she asked, her white eyes still closed. "Yes," Dimitri whispered. "You played it for me. The night before I left you. I played it for you the night you chose to leave me," she corrected, her voice sharp as a blade. "I played it hoping you would hear the truth in every note. I played it hoping you would understand that I was begging you to stay. I played it hoping you would choose love over power." She opened her white eyes and turned to face him. "But you did not hear me," she said. "You heard only the music. You did not hear the woman beneath it." Dimitri crossed the room and fell to his knees before her. It was not a gesture of submission. It was a gesture of a man who had finally understood the full scope of his damnation. "I hear you now," he said, his voice breaking. "I hear you now, Serafina. I hear every word. I hear every note. I hear the 347 years of suffering in your silence." She looked down at him, and for a moment her white eyes seemed almost human. "Good," she said softly, "because now the real game begins. When the master becomes the servant." 2 weeks had passed since the music room. 2 weeks of a slow, methodical descent into a kind of madness that Dimitri had never experienced in his 347 years of existence. It was not the madness of hunger or bloodlust. It was something far more insidious. It was the madness of complete, absolute dependency. He found himself unable to function without her presence. In the mornings, before she woke, he would stand outside her door, listening to the sound of her breathing. It was a pathetic gesture, the behavior of a lovesick fool, not a vampire king who had ruled for centuries. But he could not stop himself. Her breathing was the only thing that made him feel alive. When she moved through the castle, he followed, not as a master observing his property, but as a shadow follows the body that casts it. The servants had stopped whispering. They had simply accepted this new reality. Their master was enslaved to the blind woman, and the most terrifying part was that Dimitri knew exactly what was happening. He understood with perfect clarity that this was her plan. She was not using force or magic to bind him. She was using something far more powerful, the knowledge that he deserved this, that he had earned this through his betrayal. It was psychological torture of the highest order. On the 15th day, she summoned him to her chambers. Her chambers were in the east wing, the rooms he had prepared for her arrival. They had been transformed. Gone were the heavy velvet drapes and the oppressive darkness. Instead, the windows were open to the winter light. Plants grew in every corner, flowers that should not have survived in this frozen realm, yet they thrived under her touch. She sat by the window, her white eyes closed, her face tilted toward the pale winter sun. She wore a simple white dress, and in the morning light she looked almost ethereal, almost human. "Come," she said without opening her eyes. "Sit with me." Dimitri obeyed. He always obeyed now. He sat in the chair beside her, careful not to touch her, careful not to disturb the fragile peace that existed between them. "Do you know what I have been thinking about?" she asked softly. "No," he replied, his voice hollow. "I have been thinking about the moment you chose Katerina over me," she said, opening her white eyes and turning to face him. "I have been thinking about the exact moment you realized that immortality was more important than love. I have been thinking about the look in your eyes when you turned away from me." Dimitri's jaw tightened. "Serafina, do not speak," she interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "I did not ask you to speak. I asked you to listen." She rose from her chair and walked toward him slowly, deliberately. With each step the air seemed to grow colder, denser, as if her presence was compressing the very atmosphere around them. "I want you to understand something," she said, standing directly before him. "I want you to understand that what you are feeling now, this desperate need for my presence, this inability to function without me, this knowledge that you would do anything to keep me here, This is what I felt for you." She reached down and gripped his chin, forcing him to look up at her. "For 347 years, I felt this," she whispered. "For 347 years, I carried this weight. And now you are going to carry it too." She released him and walked to the window, her silhouette framed against the pale winter light. "But there is a difference," she continued. "You will carry this weight knowing that it is temporary. You will carry this weight knowing that one day I will take it all away. You will carry this weight knowing that your suffering has an expiration date." She turned back to face him, and her white eyes seemed to burn with an inner fire. "Whereas I carried my weight knowing that it would never end. I carried my weight knowing that I would search for you across centuries, across lifetimes, and that when I found you, I would destroy you. That was my only purpose. That was my only reason for existing." Dimitri felt something break inside him. It was not his will. It was not his pride. It was something deeper. It was the last fragment of his humanity, the last piece of his soul that had been holding out hope for redemption. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Serafina smiled, and it was the smile of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. "I want you to serve me," she said simply. "Not as a master serves a servant, but as a servant serves a master. I want you to anticipate my needs before I voice them. I want you to be present at every moment of my day. I want you to exist only for my pleasure and my purpose." She paused and her smile widened. "And I want you to thank me for the privilege." The transformation was immediate and absolute. Dimitri became her shadow. He woke before dawn to prepare her chambers. He ensured that the flowers in her room were watered with fresh spring water. He prepared her meals, simple foods, nothing that required blood or the dark sustenance of his kind. He dressed in servant's clothes, abandoning the fine silks and furs that marked him as nobility. The servants watched in stunned silence as their master became a servant. But it was not the servitude of force, it was the servitude of choice. Dimitri chose to serve her because the alternative, her absence, was unbearable. He chose to obey her commands because her voice was the only thing that made him feel alive. He chose to exist in her shadow because the light of her presence was worth any humiliation. One evening, as he was preparing her bath, she called him into the bathroom. The bathroom was filled with steam, fragrant with herbs and flowers. Serafina sat in the water, her small frame barely visible beneath the surface. Her white eyes were closed, her head tilted back against the edge of the tub. "Wash my hair," she commanded. Dimitri knelt beside the tub, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the pitcher of warm water. He poured it slowly over her dark hair, watching as the water cascaded down her back. Then he took the soap, a simple, unscented soap, and began to wash her hair with careful, reverent movements. It was an intimate act, but not in the way he had imagined intimacy with her. It was not about desire or passion. It was about service. It was about the complete surrender of his will to hers. As he washed her hair, she began to speak. "Do you remember when I used to wash your hair?" she asked softly. "When we were young, before you became what you are now. Do you remember how you would sit between my legs and let me run my fingers through your hair, and you would tell me about your dreams?" "Yes," Dimitri whispered. "I remember. You told me that you wanted to build an empire," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "You told me that you wanted to be powerful, to be feared, to be remembered, and I told you that those things were empty. I told you that the only thing that mattered was love." She opened her white eyes and looked up at him. "You did not believe me," she said. "You chose power instead. And now, 347 years later, you finally understand that I was right." Dimitri's hands stilled in her hair. He could not speak. He could not move. He could only kneel there, his hands buried in her dark hair, and feel the full weight of his damnation. "The cruelest part," she whispered, "is that you still do not have love. You have only the memory of love and the desperate hope that one day I might forgive you enough to give it to you again. She closed her eyes and leaned back against the edge of the tub. "Continue," she commanded, "and do not stop until I tell you to." Days blurred into weeks. Dimitri existed in a state of constant anticipation. Every moment was spent waiting for her next command, her next need, her next desire. He had become a ghost in his own castle, a servant in his own home. But something was changing. With each act of service, with each moment of surrender, something was shifting in the space between them. It was not forgiveness. It was not love. It was something more complex, more dangerous. It was a kind of understanding that transcended the boundaries of master and servant, predator and prey. One night, as he was preparing her chambers for sleep, she asked him a question that changed everything. "Do you love me?" she asked, her white eyes fixed on his face. Dimitri's breath caught. It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of 347 years. "Yes," he said, and the word was a confession, a prayer, a curse all at once. "I love you, Serafina. I have always loved you. I will always love you." She was silent for a long moment. Then she reached out and placed her hand on his chest, directly over where his heart should have been beating. "Good," she whispered, "because now the real punishment begins." And beneath her touch, something shifted. It was not a heartbeat. It was something deeper. It was as if she were reaching into the void where his humanity used to live, and pulling it toward the surface, inch by agonizing inch. For the first time in 347 years, Dimitri felt his heart try to beat. It was a sensation of such profound pain and pleasure that he nearly fell to his knees. It was the sensation of being reborn. It was the sensation of dying. It was the sensation of finally understanding what it meant to be alive. "What are you doing to me?" he gasped. "I am collecting my debt," she whispered, one heartbeat at a time. When the predator becomes the prey, 3 weeks after his heart began to beat again. 3 weeks of a sensation so profound, so overwhelming, that Dimitri could barely comprehend what was happening to his body. His heart beat in an irregular rhythm, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes skipping entirely, as if it were learning how to live again after 347 years of death. The pain was exquisite. It was not the pain of physical injury. It was the pain of resurrection. It was the sensation of nerve endings awakening after centuries of numbness. It was the sensation of his dead body remembering what it meant to be alive. And Serafina watched it all with the patience of a predator who knew that her prey could not escape. On the 21st night, she came to him in his chambers. His chambers were sparse now. He had stripped them of luxury, of comfort, of anything that might suggest he was still a master. The bed was simple. The walls were bare stone. The only light came from a single candle that flickered against the darkness. He was sitting by the window watching the snow fall in the frozen night when she entered. She wore a white nightgown, and in the candlelight she looked almost ethereal, almost human. Her white eyes were luminous, glowing with an inner fire that no human eyes should possess. "Come," she commanded, and he obeyed without hesitation. She led him to her chambers, to the room filled with impossible flowers and warm light. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and something else, something ancient and primal that made his predatory senses sharpen. "Lie down," she said, gesturing to the bed. Dimitri obeyed. He lay on the bed, his body tense, waiting for whatever punishment or pleasure she had planned for him. His heart was beating rapidly now, a frantic rhythm that betrayed his fear and his desire. She stood over him, her small frame silhouetted against the candlelight. Then, slowly, deliberately, she began to remove her nightgown. It fell away from her body like water, revealing skin that was pale and luminous in the darkness. But it was not the skin of a human woman. It was the skin of something ancient, something that had existed long before humans walked the earth. There were marks on her body, scars that glowed faintly with an inner light. They covered her shoulders, her arms, her torso, each one a testament to centuries of suffering. "Do you see these?" she asked, running her fingers along one of the scars. Each one is a year of my curse. Each one is a moment of pain that I endured while waiting for you. She climbed onto the bed, straddling him, her white eyes fixed on his face. I want you to understand something, she whispered. I want you to understand that what you are about to experience is not pleasure. It is not love. It is payment. She leaned down, her face inches from his, and he could smell her, that ancient primal scent that made his dead body come alive. I am going to take from you what you took from me, she said. I am going to take your blood. I am going to take your power. I am going to take your immortality, one drop at a time. Before he could respond, she opened her mouth, and her fangs descended. But they were not the fangs of a vampire. They were longer, sharper, more primal. They were the fangs of something that had existed long before vampires were even a concept. She bit him. The sensation was unlike anything Dimitri had ever experienced. It was not the bite of a vampire, a quick puncture, a moment of pain followed by pleasure. It was something far more devastating. It was as if she were reaching into his very essence and pulling it out of his body. He screamed. It was a sound of such profound agony that it echoed through the castle, a sound that made the servants cover their ears and pray that their master would survive the night. But it was not just pain. Mixed with the agony was something else, something that felt almost like pleasure. It was as if she were awakening nerve endings that had been dormant for centuries, bringing them back to life through sheer force of will. His blood flowed into her mouth, and with it something else flowed out of him. He could feel it leaving his body, his power, his immortality, his very essence as a vampire. It was being drawn out of him like poison from a wound. When she finally released him, he was gasping for breath, his body covered in sweat and blood. She sat back, her white eyes now glowing with a deep crimson light. Her lips were stained with his blood, and she looked more alive than she had ever looked before. Do you understand now? She whispered, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. Do you understand what it means to be drained? Do you understand what it means to feel your very essence being pulled from your body? Dimitri could not speak. He could barely breathe. His body was trembling, and not from fear. It was from the sensation of being unmade and remade simultaneously. Your blood is ancient, she continued, running her finger along her lips, tasting his blood. It is old and powerful and filled with the memory of 347 years, but it is nothing compared to mine. She leaned down again, and this time she offered him her wrist. Drink, she commanded. Dimitri hesitated. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to refuse. Drinking from her would bind him to her in ways he could not comprehend. It would make him dependent on her in ways that went beyond the psychological. But he was no longer capable of refusing her. He took her wrist, and he drank. Her blood was unlike anything he had ever tasted. It was not the blood of a human. It was not even the blood of a vampire. It was ancient, primal, filled with a power so profound that it nearly destroyed him. With each drop he felt something shift inside him. His dead heart beat faster. His dead body came alive. His dead soul began to remember what it meant to exist. But there was something else in her blood. There was a memory, a vision, a moment from the past that was not his own. He saw himself as he had been in 1679, young, human, desperate for power. He saw Serafina as she had been then, radiant, powerful, ancient beyond measure. He saw the moment she had fallen in love with him. He saw the moment she had decided to save his life. And he saw the moment she had cursed him. It was not a moment of rage or vengeance. It was a moment of profound sorrow. She had cursed him not out of anger, but out of love. She had cursed him because she could not bear the thought of him choosing immortality with another woman. She had cursed him to 347 years of solitude, because she wanted him to understand, finally, what it meant to lose everything. When he released her wrist, he was weeping. "Why?" he gasped, his voice breaking. "Why did you curse me if you loved me? Serafina smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had finally achieved her purpose. "Because love without pain is not love," she whispered. "It is just a pleasant sensation. But love that costs you everything, love that destroys you and rebuilds you, that is real love." She lay beside him, her small body fitting perfectly against his, her white eyes fixed on his face. "And now," she continued, "you are beginning to understand what I have always known. You are beginning to understand that I am not your punishment. I am your salvation." The night stretched on in silence. Dimitri lay beside her, his body still trembling from the experience of drinking her blood. His mind was flooded with visions, centuries of memories that were not his own, but that he could now access through the connection they had formed. He could see her entire history. He could see the moment she was born, not as a human, but as something ancient and primal. He could see the centuries she had lived before humans even existed. He could see the moment she had decided to become human, to walk among mortals, to experience love and loss and pain. And he could see the moment she had met him. In his vision, he was a young man, barely 20 years old, dying of a fever in a small village. She had come to him as a healer, and she had saved his life. But in saving his life, she had fallen in love with him. She had fallen in love with his potential, his dreams, his desperate hunger for something more than the small life he had been born into. She had loved him so completely that she had decided to give him immortality. She had planned to turn him herself, to make him like her, to spend eternity with him. But he had chosen Katerina instead. And in that moment of betrayal, something had broken in the universe. Seraphine's love had transformed into something darker, something more primal. It had become a curse so powerful that it had rippled through time itself. When Dimitri finally opened his eyes, dawn was breaking over the frozen landscape. Serafina was still beside him, her white eyes closed, her breathing steady and even. She looked almost peaceful, almost human, but he could feel the power radiating from her, the ancient primal force that existed beneath her delicate exterior. He understood now she was not a vampire, she was not a werewolf, she was something far older, far more powerful. She was an Ansheg, a creature that had existed since before the concept of good and evil had been invented. She was a being of pure power, pure will, pure intention, and she had chosen to bind herself to him. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. He reached out and placed his hand on her chest, directly over where her heart should have been beating. And beneath his touch, he felt it, a heartbeat that was not quite human, but not quite inhuman either. It was a heartbeat that carried the weight of millennia. She opened her white eyes and looked at him. "Now you understand," she whispered. "Now you understand what I am. And now you understand that you can never escape me. You are bound to me, Dimitri Volkov. You are bound to me for eternity." The truth, written in blood and sorrow the morning after he drank her blood. Dimitri woke alone. The bed beside him was cold, the sheets undisturbed except for the faint impression of where she had lain. He could still taste her blood on his lips, ancient, primal, intoxicating. But more than that, he could still feel the visions, the memories, the centuries of her existence flooding through his consciousness like a river that had broken through a dam. He rose from the bed, his body moving with a strange new grace. His heart was beating steadily now, a rhythm that felt almost natural. But something was different. He could feel his power diminishing, like sand slipping through an hourglass. With each heartbeat, he was losing something, his immortality, his strength, his very essence as a vampire. He found her in the library. She was sitting in the same chair where he had fallen to his knees weeks ago, reading the ancient book, the one with his handwriting and her responses in the margins. She did not look up when he entered, but she smiled as if she had been expecting him. "You can feel it, cannot you?" she said softly. "The way your power is draining away. The way your immortality is being consumed. One heartbeat at a time." Dimitri crossed the library and stood before her, his dark eyes fixed on her white ones. "Why?" he demanded, his voice rough with emotion. "Why are you doing this? Why drain me slowly when you could simply kill me and be done with it?" Serafina closed the book and set it aside. Then she rose from her chair with a grace that was utterly inhuman, and she walked toward him. With each step, the air seemed to grow colder, denser, as if her presence was compressing the very atmosphere around them. "Because death would be mercy," she said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "And you do not deserve mercy, Dimitri Volkov. You deserve to understand, finally, what it means to lose everything." She reached up and placed her small hand on his chest, directly over where his heart was now beating. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to the chair she had just vacated. Dimitri obeyed without hesitation. He had learned over the past weeks that resistance was futile. She was the master now. He was merely the servant. Serafina sat across from him, her white eyes fixed on his face, and then she began to speak. "I was born 3,000 years ago," she said, her voice carrying the weight of millennia. "Not as a human, not as a vampire, not as anything that your modern mind could comprehend. I was born as an Ansheg, a being of pure power, pure will, pure intention. I existed before humans walked the earth. I existed before the concept of good and evil had been invented." She paused, and her white eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. "For thousands of years, I lived in solitude," she continued. "I watched civilizations rise and fall. I watched empires crumble to dust. I watched humans create and destroy and create again, endlessly repeating the same patterns of greed and violence and desperation." She rose from her chair and began to pace, her small frame moving with an otherworldly grace. "And then, in 1679, I decided to become human," she said. "I decided to walk among mortals, to experience their lives, their loves, their losses. I decided to understand what it meant to be fragile, to be temporary, to be mortal." She turned to face him, and her expression was one of profound sorrow. "I came to a small village in the Northern Territories," she continued, "and I found you. You were dying of a fever, burning up from the inside, your body ravaged by disease. You were so young, so desperate, so hungry for something more than the small life you had been born into." Dimitri felt something shift in his chest. The memories she had shown him through her blood were becoming clearer, more vivid. "I saved your life," she whispered. "I used my power to heal you. I used my ancient magic to pull you back from the brink of death. And in doing so, I fell in love with you." She walked toward him slowly, deliberately, like a predator stalking wounded prey. "I loved you with a completeness that I had never experienced before," she said. "I loved you with the desperation of a being who had lived for 3,000 years without knowing what love meant. I loved you so completely that I decided to give you immortality. I decided to make you like me, so that we could spend eternity together." She paused, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "But you chose someone else." The memory came flooding back with devastating clarity. Dimitri saw himself as he had been in 1679, young, human, desperate for power. He saw Serafina as she had been then, radiant, powerful, ancient beyond measure. He saw the moment she had revealed what she was, the moment she had offered him immortality, the moment she had promised him eternity. And he saw the moment Katerina had arrived. Katerina was a vampire, ancient, powerful, beautiful, in the way that only the damned can be beautiful. She had come to the village hunting, and she had found him instead. She had seduced him with promises of power, of immortality, of a life beyond the constraints of human mortality. But more than that, she had offered him something that Serafina could not. She had offered him the illusion of freedom. With Serafina, he would have been bound to her forever, dependent on her, subservient to her power. With Katerina, he could be his own master. He could build his own empire. He could be a god. He had chosen Katerina. He had left Serafina without explanation. He had allowed himself to be turned, to be transformed into a creature of the night. And when Serafina had come looking for him, when she had found him in Katerina's arms, he had not even looked at her. He had simply turned away. "I came to you that night," Serafina said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I came to you after you had been turned, after you had chosen immortality with another woman. I came to you with my heart in my hands, begging you to choose me, begging you to come back to me." She paused, and her white eyes seemed to burn with an inner fire. "And you laughed at me," she whispered. "You laughed at me and told me that I was weak, that I was pathetic, that I was nothing compared to Katerina. You told me that I was a fool for thinking that a creature like you would ever choose love over power." Dimitri felt tears streaming down his face. He remembered that night. He remembered the cruelty in his voice, the contempt in his eyes. He remembered the look of devastation on her face as he turned away from her. That night, Serafina continued, "I made a choice. I decided that if you would not choose love, then I would make you suffer for it. I decided that I would curse you to 347 years of solitude. I decided that I would curse you to feel nothing but hunger, to experience nothing but emptiness, to live in a world where every connection you made would eventually crumble to dust." She walked toward him and placed her hands on either side of his face. "I cursed you to 347 years of waiting," she whispered. 347 years of searching for something that would make you feel alive. 347 years of knowing deep in your soul that you had made a terrible mistake. She released him and stepped back. And then she said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper, "I cursed myself." Dimitri's breath caught. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice hollow. Serafina walked to the window and looked out at the frozen landscape beyond. "I cursed myself to be reborn blind," she said. "I cursed myself to lose my power to become human, to be stripped of everything that made me an Anshig. I cursed myself to search for you across centuries, across lifetimes, until I found you again." She turned back to face him, and her white eyes were filled with tears. "I cursed myself because I could not bear the thought of living in a world where you existed but did not love me," she continued. "I cursed myself because I wanted to understand what it meant to be human, to be fragile, to be temporary. I cursed myself because I wanted to suffer as you had made me suffer." She walked toward him slowly, deliberately. "And I cursed myself with a purpose," she said. "I cursed myself knowing that one day I would find you again. I cursed myself knowing that when I found you, I would make you remember. I cursed myself knowing that I would make you love me again. And then I would destroy you." She knelt before him, her small frame at his eye level, her white eyes fixed on his face. "But something unexpected happened," she whispered. "Something that I did not anticipate, something that changed everything." "What?" Dimitri asked, his voice breaking. "I fell in love with you again," she said, and the words were a confession, a prayer, a curse, all at once. "I fell in love with you not because of who you were, but because of who you became. I fell in love with you because you finally understood what it meant to lose everything. I fell in love with you because you chose to serve me, not because you had to, but because you wanted to." She reached up and placed her hand on his chest, directly over where his heart was beating. "And now," she whispered, "I am faced with a choice. I can complete my curse. I can drain you completely, take your immortality, take your power, take your very existence. I can destroy you as I promised myself I would." She paused, and her white eyes seemed to burn with an inner fire. "Or I can forgive you." The silence that followed was absolute. Dimitri could not speak. He could not move. He could only kneel there, his heart beating in his chest, and feel the full weight of his damnation and his salvation simultaneously. "What do you want me to do?" he whispered. Serafina smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had finally achieved her purpose. "I want you to choose," she said. "I want you to choose between your immortality and your love for me. I want you to choose between your power and your humanity. I want you to choose between the god you have been and the man you could become. She stood and extended her hand to him. Choose, Dimitri Volkov, she commanded. Choose now, and choose wisely. Because your choice will determine not only your fate, but the fate of everyone you have ever loved. When the servant becomes the god, Dimitri did not answer. He could not answer. The weight of her question hung in the air like a blade suspended above water, waiting to fall. To choose love meant to surrender everything he had built over 347 years. To choose immortality meant to lose her forever. It was an impossible choice. Serafina waited, her white eyes fixed on his face, her small frame silhouetted against the candlelight. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply waited with the patience of someone who had already lived 3,000 years and could wait 3,000 more. Minutes stretched into hours. The library grew darker as the sun set beyond the windows. The candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. And still Dimitri could not speak, could not choose, could not decide between the two halves of his existence. Finally, as midnight approached, he rose from his chair. I choose, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Seraphine's white eyes seemed to glow brighter in the darkness. I choose you, he continued, and the words were a confession, a prayer, a curse, all at once. I choose love. I choose humanity. I choose to become something new. He walked toward her slowly, deliberately, and he knelt before her. It was not a gesture of submission. It was a gesture of surrender. It was the gesture of a man who had finally understood what it meant to lose everything and gain something infinitely more valuable. Then let it begin, she whispered. The transformation did not happen all at once. It was a slow, methodical process that unfolded over the course of 3 days and 3 nights. Dimitri locked himself in his chambers with Serafina, and the servants were ordered to leave them undisturbed. No one knew what was happening behind those closed doors. No one dared to ask. But the castle itself seemed to respond to the transformation. The stone walls began to glow with a faint, ethereal light. The temperature fluctuated wildly, one moment freezing, the next burning hot. The wind howled through the parapets with a sound like the screams of the damned. And deep beneath the castle, in the dungeons that had been sealed for centuries, something ancient began to awaken. On the first night, Serafina took his blood. She bit him with those primal fangs, and she drank deeply. But this time, she did not drain him. This time, she was taking something specific, the curse itself. She was pulling the 347 years of solitude, the 347 years of emptiness, the 347 years of hunger out of his body and into her own. Dimitri screamed as the curse left him. It was a sound of such profound agony that it shattered the windows of his chambers, sending shards of glass cascading down into the frozen courtyard below. When she released him, he was gasping for breath, his body covered in sweat and blood. But something had changed. The weight that had been pressing down on him for 347 years was gone. The void that had been consuming him from the inside was beginning to fill. On the second night, she gave him her blood. But this time, it was different. This time, she was not just offering him her memories. She was offering him her power. She was offering him her essence as an Anshig. She was offering him the accumulated knowledge and strength of 3,000 years of existence. Dimitri drank, and with each drop he felt himself transforming. His dead heart beat faster. His dead body came alive. His dead soul began to remember what it meant to exist. But the transformation was not just physical. It was spiritual. It was as if she were reaching into the very core of his being and remaking him from the inside out. She was stripping away the predator, the god, the immortal creature he had been, and she was rebuilding him as something new, something that had never existed before, something that was both human and divine, something that was both mortal and eternal, something that was both vulnerable and infinitely powerful. On the third night, the transformation reached its climax. Dimitri's body began to change. His skin, which had been pale and cold for 347 years, began to warm. Color returned to his cheeks. His eyes, which had been dark and predatory, began to shift. They became lighter, more human, but with flecks of gold that glowed with an inner fire. His fangs receded, his claws disappeared. His predatory nature began to fade, replaced by something more complex, more nuanced, more human. But at the same time, something else was awakening inside him. It was not the power of a vampire. It was not the power of a werewolf. It was the power of an Anshig, the accumulated strength of 3,000 years, the knowledge of civilizations long forgotten, the magic of a being that had existed since before the concept of good and evil had been invented. He was becoming a hybrid. He was becoming something that had never existed before in the history of the world. And Serafina was there with him through every moment of the transformation, her small hand on his chest, her white eyes fixed on his face, her voice whispering words of encouragement and love. "You are almost there," she whispered as his body convulsed with the pain of transformation. "You are almost complete. Just a little longer, just a little more pain, and you will be reborn when the transformation finally ended." As dawn broke over the frozen landscape, Dimitri opened his eyes and saw the world for the first time, not with the eyes of a vampire, not with the eyes of a human, but with the eyes of something new, something that could see the threads of magic that connected all living things, something that could perceive the flow of time itself, stretching backward into the past and forward into the future. He sat up slowly, his body moving with a grace that was utterly inhuman. He looked down at his hands and he saw that they were glowing faintly with an inner light. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, and he saw a man who was both familiar and completely foreign. He was no longer Dimitri Volkov, the Vampire King. He was something new, something that had no name, something that existed in the space between mortality and immortality, between humanity and divinity, between love and power. Serafina stood beside him, her white eyes fixed on his face, and for the first time since he had known her, she smiled, not the smile of a predator, not the smile of a woman seeking revenge, but the smile of a woman who had finally achieved her purpose. "Welcome," she whispered, "to your new existence." But the transformation had consequences. As Dimitri's power grew, as he began to understand the full scope of what he had become, he realized something terrifying. With each moment that passed, Serafina was growing weaker. The curse that she had taken from him, the 347 years of solitude and emptiness, was consuming her from the inside. She was aging. Her white eyes were beginning to dim. Her small frame was becoming frailer. She was dying. Dimitri realized this on the fourth day, when he found her collapsed in the conservatory, surrounded by the flowers that had once thrived under her touch. The flowers were wilting now, their petals falling like snow. "No," he said, falling to his knees beside her. "No, Serafina, you cannot die. You cannot leave me." She looked up at him, and her white eyes were barely glowing now. "I am not dying," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am transforming, just as you did." "Into what?" Dimitri demanded, his voice breaking. "Into something human," she said, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "For the first time in 3,000 years, I am becoming human. I am becoming mortal. I am becoming fragile." She reached up and placed her small hand on his chest, directly over where his heart was beating. "And you," she continued, "are becoming something more than human. You are becoming the god I always knew you could be, but not the god you were before. Not a god of power and conquest and domination, a god of love, a god of redemption, a god of second chances." Dimitri pulled her close, his body trembling with emotion. "I will not let you die," he said fiercely. "I will not let you become human. I will not let you become fragile. You do not have a choice," she whispered. This is the price of my curse. This is the price of my love. I gave you my power, and in doing so, I gave you my immortality. Now I must pay the price." She closed her eyes, and her breathing became shallow. "But do not mourn me," she continued softly, "because I am finally at peace. I am finally free from the curse I placed on myself 347 years ago. I am finally free to rest. When eternity becomes mortality 5 days after the transformation, Dimitri understood what it meant to die. Not the physical death of the body, but the slow, methodical death of the soul. The gradual erosion of everything that made him who he was. The inexorable march toward an ending that he could not escape, could not fight, could not deny. Serafina was draining him. Not with her fangs, not with her blood, but with her presence, with every moment they spent together, with every touch of her hand, with every whispered word of love. She was pulling something essential from his being. She was taking his immortality, his power, his very essence as a god, and she was consuming it. And the most terrifying part was that he could feel it happening. He would wake in the morning and notice that his hands were slightly less luminous than they had been the day before. He would look in the mirror and see that the gold flecks in his eyes were fading, becoming less vibrant. He would try to access the power of the ansig that flowed through his veins, and he would find that it was slipping away like sand through an hourglass. He was aging. For the first time in 347 years, Dimitri Volkov was aging. His skin, which had been perfect and unblemished, was beginning to show the faint lines of time. His hair, which had been dark and lustrous, was beginning to show threads of silver. His body, which had been sculpted and powerful, was beginning to show the subtle signs of mortality. He was becoming human. On the 6th day, he confronted her. He found her in the conservatory tending to the flowers that were now wilting and dying. Her white eyes were barely glowing now, and her small frame seemed even more fragile than before. She moved slowly, carefully, as if each step required an enormous effort. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rough with emotion. Serafina did not turn around. She simply continued to tend to the dying flowers, her small hands moving with a grace that was becoming increasingly labored. "I am collecting my debt," she said softly, "one heartbeat at a time." "You are killing yourself," Dimitri said, crossing the conservatory toward her. "You are taking my immortality and using it to sustain your own mortality. You are sacrificing yourself for me." Serafina finally turned to face him, and her white eyes were filled with tears. "Yes," she said simply, "that is exactly what I am doing." Dimitri felt something break inside him. It was not his will. It was not his pride. It was something deeper. It was the last fragment of his selfishness, the last piece of his arrogance that had been holding out hope that he could have both immortality and love, power and redemption, godhood and humanity. "Why?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "Why would you do this? Why would you sacrifice yourself for me when I do not deserve it?" Serafina walked toward him slowly, deliberately, and she placed her small hand on his chest, directly over where his heart was beating. "Because love is not about deserving," she whispered. "Love is about choosing. And I choose you, Dimitri Volkov. I choose you over immortality. I choose you over power. I choose you over everything I have ever been." She closed her eyes and her breathing became shallow. "I have lived for 3,000 years," she continued softly. "I have watched civilizations rise and fall. I have watched empires crumble to dust. I have watched humans create and destroy, and create again, endlessly repeating the same patterns of greed and violence and desperation." She opened her white eyes and looked directly at him. "But I have never, in all of those 3,000 years, experienced what I am experiencing now," she said. "I have never felt the weight of mortality. I have never felt the urgency of time running out. I have never felt the desperate, consuming need to make every moment count, because I know that there are only a finite number of moments left." She paused, and her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "And it is the most beautiful thing I have ever experienced." The days that followed were a descent into a kind of madness. Dimitri watched as Serafina aged before his eyes, not slowly, but with an accelerating speed that defied all natural law. Each day she seemed to lose years. Her white eyes began to show the faint lines of age. Her small frame became even more fragile. Her voice, which had carried the weight of centuries, began to crack and waver. She was dying, and Dimitri was powerless to stop it. He tried to refuse her touch, thinking that if he could prevent her from draining him, he could somehow slow her aging. But she would simply smile and place her hand on his chest anyway, and he would feel the power flowing out of him like water through a broken dam. He tried to leave the castle, thinking that if he could put distance between them, he could somehow preserve what remained of his immortality. But he found that he could not. The bond between them was too strong. The moment he tried to leave, he felt a pain so profound, so absolute, that it brought him to his knees. He was bound to her, completely, utterly, irrevocably bound. On the 10th day she could barely walk. Dimitri carried her from her chambers to the conservatory, where she insisted on spending her final days surrounded by the flowers that had once thrived under her touch. The flowers were all dead now, their petals brown and brittle, their stems withered and dry. "I am sorry," she whispered as he laid her gently on a cushioned chair. "I am sorry that I am leaving you. I am sorry that I will not be here to see what you become." "Do not speak like that," Dimitri said, his voice breaking. "You are not leaving me. You are not dying. You cannot die." Serafina smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had finally achieved her purpose. "I am not dying," she said softly. "I am transforming, just as you did, just as we both did." She reached up and placed her small hand on his face, her fingers tracing the lines that had appeared over the past 10 days. "You are becoming human," she whispered, "and I am becoming something else, something that exists between life and death. Something that exists between the mortal world and the world of the Anshig." Dimitri felt tears streaming down his face. He had not cried in 347 years. But now, as he watched the woman he loved slip away from him, he could not stop the tears. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking. "Please do not leave me. Please do not die. I cannot bear to lose you. Not after everything. Not after finally finding you again." Seraphine's white eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the conservatory. "You will not lose me," she whispered. "I will always be with you. In every heartbeat, in every breath, in every moment of your mortal life, I will be there, guiding you, protecting you, loving you." She closed her eyes, and her breathing became even more shallow. "But you must promise me something," she continued, her voice barely audible. "You must promise me that you will use your new life wisely. You must promise me that you will not become the god you were before. You must promise me that you will become the man you could have been if you had chosen love instead of power." "I promise," Dimitri whispered, gripping her small hand. "I promise you, Serafina. I will spend the rest of my mortal life honoring the sacrifice you have made for me." Serafina smiled, and it was the smile of a woman at peace. "Good," she whispered, "because now the real test begins." On the 11th day, she stopped aging. Dimitri woke to find her lying beside him, her body perfectly still, her breathing barely perceptible. She looked exactly as she had when he first met her at the auction, young, beautiful, ethereal. But her white eyes were closed, and they did not open when he called her name. She was in a state between life and death, not alive but not dead, not mortal but not immortal. She existed in a space that defied all natural law, in a moment that seemed to stretch on forever. Dimitri held her small hand in his, and he felt the faintest pulse of life still flowing through her veins. She was still there. She was still with him, but she was no longer of this world. He understood then what she had meant when she said she was transforming. She had not died. She had transcended. She had moved beyond the boundaries of mortality and immortality, beyond the boundaries of life and death, into a state of existence that was entirely new. And he was left behind, mortal, aging, finite, watching the woman he loved slip away into a realm he could not follow. The pain was unbearable. It was a pain so profound, so absolute, that it made the pain of his transformation seem insignificant. It was the pain of loss. It was the pain of knowing that he would age and die while she existed in that space between worlds. It was the pain of knowing that he had been given a second chance at life, but that the woman who had given him that chance would never be able to share it with him. He held her hand through the night, and he wept. He wept for the 347 years he had lost. He wept for the love he had rejected. He wept for the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. He wept for the man he had been, and the man he was becoming. And as dawn broke over the frozen landscape, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows of the conservatory, Dimitri made a decision. He would not waste the life she had given him. He would not squander the second chance she had provided. He would spend every moment of his mortal existence honoring her sacrifice, serving her memory, and becoming the man she had always believed he could be. Even if it meant spending the rest of his life alone. Even if it meant watching her slip further and further away from him with each passing day. Even if it meant dying knowing that he would never see her again in this world. He would do it, because that was what love meant. That was what true love meant. When love becomes a prison 12 days after she stopped aging. 12 days of watching her lie motionless in that space between life and death, her white eyes closed, her breathing barely perceptible. 12 days of holding her hand, whispering words of love and apology, begging her to come back to him, knowing all the while that she could not. 12 days of understanding, with perfect clarity, what it meant to be truly alone. The castle had become a tomb. The servants had stopped coming to the East Wing. They sensed that something sacred, something profane, something utterly beyond their comprehension was happening in those chambers. They left food outside the door, bread, cheese, water, and Dimitri would consume it mechanically, without tasting it, without feeling anything but the hollow ache of her absence. He had aged another 10 years in those 12 days. His hair was now completely silver. The lines on his face had deepened, becoming crevasses of sorrow. His body, which had been sculpted and powerful, was now showing the unmistakable signs of mortality. His hands trembled when he held hers. His breath came in shallow gasps when he climbed the stairs. He was dying, not quickly, but inexorably. With each passing day, he could feel his life force draining away, like sand through an hourglass. The power that she had given him was being consumed by the bond between them, by the desperate need to keep her alive, to keep her in this world, to prevent her from slipping away completely. On the 13th day, she spoke. Her white eyes opened slowly, as if she were waking from a long sleep. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of centuries. "You are dying," she said, her white eyes fixed on his face. Dimitri did not deny it. There was no point in denying the obvious. "Yes," he said simply. "I am dying, and I do not care. As long as you are here, as long as I can hold your hand, I do not care if I die." Seraphine's white eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the chamber. "That is not acceptable," she whispered. "I did not sacrifice my immortality so that you could throw away your life." She reached up with trembling fingers and placed her small hand on his chest, directly over where his heart was beating slowly, irregularly, the heartbeat of a dying man. "I have an offer for you," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of her decision. An offer that will change everything. An offer that will give you a choice you did not have before. Dimitri leaned closer, his ear near her lips, straining to hear her words. You can choose to die, she whispered. You can choose to let go, to release yourself from the bond that binds us, to move on to whatever comes after this life. You can choose peace. You can choose rest. You can choose to finally escape the weight of your own existence. She paused, and her white eyes seemed to burn with an inner fire. Or, she continued, you can choose to live. You can choose to serve me for eternity. You can choose to bind yourself to me, not as a vampire, not as a god, but as a man who has chosen love over everything else. You can choose to exist in this world, aging, dying, being reborn again and again, as long as it takes for me to find my way back to you. Dimitri felt something break inside him. It was not his will. It was not his pride. It was something deeper. It was the last fragment of his hope that he could have both love and freedom, connection and independence, devotion and autonomy. What do you mean, reborn again and again? He asked, his voice breaking. Serafina smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had finally achieved her purpose. I mean that I will bind your soul to mine, she said softly. I mean that when you die, you will not move on to whatever comes after. You will be reborn. You will return to this world, and you will search for me again. And when you find me, you will love me again. And we will repeat this cycle over and over for eternity. She closed her eyes, and her breathing became even more shallow. Unless, she continued, you choose to let go. Unless you choose to die and move on to whatever comes after. Unless you choose to escape the cycle. Dimitri felt tears streaming down his face. It was an impossible choice. It was a choice between two forms of damnation. It was a choice between dying alone and living forever in service to the woman he loved. How long? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. How long will I have to serve you? How long will this cycle continue? Serafina opened her white eyes and looked directly at him. Until I am ready to let you go, she said simply. Until I have suffered enough. Until I have been loved enough. Until I have been forgiven enough. She paused, and her voice dropped to barely a whisper. And that, she continued, may be forever. Dimitri sat in silence for a long time. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply held her small hand in his, and felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him like a physical force. To choose death meant to escape her. It meant to move on to whatever came after, to find peace, to find rest, to find freedom from the weight of his own existence. It meant to finally be released from the curse that had defined his entire life. But it also meant to leave her alone. It meant to abandon her, in that space between life and death, to leave her without the one person who loved her completely, without reservation, without condition. It meant to betray her one final time. To choose life meant to bind himself to her forever. It meant to age and die and be reborn again and again, searching for her across lifetimes, loving her across centuries, serving her across eternities. It meant to surrender his will completely, to become nothing more than an instrument of her desire, to exist only for her pleasure and her purpose. But it also meant to never leave her. It meant to be with her, always, in every life, in every moment of existence. It meant to finally understand what it meant to love someone more than you loved yourself. As dawn broke over the frozen landscape, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows of the chamber, Dimitri made his decision. I choose, he said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face, to serve you. He leaned down and placed his forehead against hers. I choose to love you, he continued. I choose to bind my soul to yours. I choose to be reborn again and again, as many times as it takes, for as long as it takes. until you are ready to let me go." He pulled back just enough to look into her white eyes. "I choose you, Seraphina," he whispered. "I choose you over death. I choose you over freedom. I choose you over everything." Seraphine's white eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire so bright that it nearly blinded him. "Then let it be done," she whispered. And she reached up and placed her small hand on his chest, directly over where his heart was beating. And beneath her touch, something shifted. It was not a heartbeat. It was something deeper. It was as if she were reaching into the very core of his being and binding his soul to hers, creating a connection so profound, so absolute, that it transcended the boundaries of life and death, of mortality and immortality, of time itself. Dimitri gasped as the binding took hold. It was a sensation of such profound pain and pleasure that he nearly fell to his knees. It was the sensation of being unmade and remade simultaneously. It was the sensation of dying and being reborn in the same moment. When the binding was complete, he opened his eyes and looked at her. She was glowing. Her entire body was radiating a light so bright, so pure, that it seemed to come from the very core of her being. Her white eyes were burning with a fire that was not quite human, not quite divine, but something in between. "It is done," she whispered, and her voice carried the weight of eternity. "You are bound to me now, Dimitri Volkov. Your soul is bound to mine. Your life is bound to mine. Your death is bound to mine." She closed her eyes, and her breathing became even more shallow. "And now," she continued, her voice barely audible, "I can finally rest. When the god becomes human, the binding was complete." Dimitri could feel it in every fiber of his being, a connection so profound, so absolute, that it transcended the boundaries of life and death, of mortality and immortality, of time itself. His soul was no longer his own. It belonged to her. It would always belong to her. And the most terrifying part was that he did not want it back. For 3 days after the binding, he lay beside her in that space between life and death, holding her small hand, feeling the faint pulse of her existence, understanding with perfect clarity that he would spend eternity in service to this woman. He would age and die and be reborn again and again, searching for her across lifetimes, loving her across centuries, serving her across eternities. It was not a punishment, it was a gift. On the 4th day something changed. Dimitri woke to find that his aging had stopped. The silver in his hair remained, but no new lines appeared on his face. His body, which had been deteriorating rapidly, stabilized. He was no longer dying. He was no longer aging. He was suspended in a state of perfect equilibrium, human but not entirely mortal, alive but not entirely living. He was something new. He rose from the bed and walked to the mirror. The man who looked back at him was a stranger. His hair was silver, his face lined with the weight of centuries, his eyes carrying the knowledge of 3,000 years of existence. But beneath the surface, he could feel something else. He could feel the power of the Anshig flowing through his veins, dormant but present, waiting to be awakened. He was no longer a vampire. He was no longer a god. He was something that had never existed before in the history of the world. He was a man who had chosen love over power, servitude over freedom, mortality over immortality. He was a man who had bound his soul to an Anshig and accepted the consequences of that binding without hesitation or regret. He was a man who had finally understood what it meant to be truly alive. When he returned to the chamber, Seraphine's white eyes were open. She was looking at him with an expression that was not quite human, not quite divine, but something in between. Her small body was still motionless, still suspended in that space between life and death. But her eyes were alive with an inner fire that seemed to burn with the intensity of 1,000 suns. "You have accepted your fate," she said, her voice carrying the weight of eternity. "Yes," Dimitri replied, kneeling beside her, "I have accepted it, and I am at peace." Seraphine's white eyes seemed to glow brighter. "Then it is time for you to understand what you have truly become," she whispered. She reached up with trembling fingers and placed her small hand on his chest, directly over where his heart was beating. And beneath her touch, Dimitri felt something shift. It was not a heartbeat. It was something deeper. It was as if she were reaching into the very core of his being and awakening something that had been dormant since the moment of the binding. Visions flooded his consciousness. He saw himself in 1,000 different lives. He saw himself as a warrior in ancient Rome fighting for a woman with white eyes who stood at the edge of the battlefield. He saw himself as a scholar in medieval Baghdad, writing poetry for a blind woman who could see more than any sighted person. He saw himself as a peasant in Renaissance Florence, building a garden for a woman who could make flowers bloom in the middle of winter. In every life, he was searching for her. In every life, he was loving her. In every life, he was serving her. And in every life, she was there, waiting for him, guiding him, loving him in return. The visions continued, stretching backward into the past and forward into the future. He saw the moment of his first meeting with her in 1679. He saw the moment he chose Katerina over her. He saw the moment she cursed him. He saw the moment she cursed herself. And he saw the moment she would finally let him go. It was not in this lifetime. It was not in the next lifetime. It was not in 100 lifetimes or 1,000 lifetimes. It was at the end of time itself, when the universe had grown old and tired, when the stars had burned out and the darkness had consumed everything. It was in that final moment, when there was nothing left but silence and void, that she would release him from the binding. And in that moment, he would finally be free. When the visions faded, Dimitri opened his eyes and looked at her. "I understand now," he whispered. "I understand what you have given me. I understand what you have taken from me. I understand that I will search for you across lifetimes, and that I will find you again and again, and that I will love you again and again, until the end of time itself." Serafina smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had finally achieved her purpose. "Yes," she said softly, "that is exactly what you will do." She closed her eyes, and her breathing became even more shallow. But before that she continued, her voice barely audible. "You must live this life. You must live it fully, completely, without regret. You must become the man I always knew you could be. You must use the power I have given you to help others, to heal others, to love others." She paused, and her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "You must become a god of love, not a god of power." The weeks that followed were a transformation of a different kind. Dimitri emerged from the chambers a changed man. He moved through the castle with a purpose that had been absent for 347 years. He began to use his power, the power of the Anshig that flowed through his veins, not for conquest or domination, but for healing and redemption. He opened the castle to the poor and the sick. He used his ancient knowledge to cure diseases that had plagued the village for generations. He used his power to make the frozen lands fertile, to bring warmth to the cold, to bring light to the darkness. The servants watched in amazement as their master transformed from a predatory creature of the night into something that resembled a saint. But Dimitri knew the truth. He was not a saint. He was a man who had been given a second chance, and he was determined not to waste it. He was a man who had bound his soul to an Ansheg, and he was determined to honor that binding by becoming worthy of her sacrifice. One evening, as he was tending to a sick child in the village, he felt a familiar presence. It was Serafina. She was not physically present. She was not in the room with him. But he could feel her, like a whisper in his mind, like a warmth in his chest, like a presence that transcended the boundaries of life and death. She was with him. She would always be with him, in every moment of his life, in every breath he took, in every heartbeat that echoed in his chest. She would be there. She would be guiding him, protecting him, loving him. And when this life ended, when his body grew old and tired and finally gave out, he would be reborn. He would search for her again. He would find her again. He would love her again, and the cycle would continue for eternity, when the end becomes a beginning 1 year after the binding. 1 year of living as a man who is no longer entirely human but not quite divine. 1 year of using his power to heal the sick, to feed the hungry, to bring light to the darkness that had consumed the frozen lands for centuries. 1 year of feeling her presence in every moment, in every breath, in every heartbeat that echoed in his chest. 1 year of being completely, utterly, irrevocably in love. The castle had transformed. What had once been a monument to isolation and power was now a beacon of hope. The frozen land surrounding it had begun to thaw. Flowers bloomed where only ice had existed before. The village that had once cowered in fear of the vampire king now thrived under the protection of the man he had become. And through it all, Serafina remained in that space between life and death. Her body had not changed. She still lay in the chamber, her white eyes closed, her breathing barely perceptible. But Dimitri could feel her presence more strongly with each passing day. She was not dead. She was not alive. She was something in between, something that transcended the boundaries of mortality and immortality. She was waiting. On the anniversary of the binding, Dimitri woke to find her white eyes open. She was looking at him with an expression that was not quite human, not quite divine, but something in between. Her small body was still motionless, still suspended in that space between life and death. But her eyes were alive with an inner fire that seemed to burn with the intensity of 1,000 suns. "It is time," she said, her voice carrying the weight of eternity. "Time for what?" Dimitri asked, kneeling beside her. Seraphine's white eyes seemed to glow brighter. "Time for you to understand the true nature of your curse," she whispered. "Time for you to understand why I bound your soul to mine. Time for you to understand what is coming." She reached up with trembling fingers and placed her small hand on his chest, directly over where his heart was beating. And beneath her touch, Dimitri felt something shift. It was not a heartbeat. It was something deeper. It was as if she were reaching into the very core of his being and awakening something that had been dormant since the moment of the binding. A vision flooded his consciousness. He saw the future. He saw a child being born, a child with eyes that were neither white nor gold, but a swirling combination of both. A child with power that transcended the boundaries of vampire and Anshig. A child that was something entirely new. The child was theirs. "What?" Dimitri gasped, pulling back from her touch. "How is this possible? You are suspended between life and death. I am bound to you. How can we have a child?" Serafina smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had finally achieved her purpose. "Because love transcends the boundaries of life and death," she whispered. "Because our souls are bound together, and from that binding, new life will emerge. Because the universe itself has decided that our story is not yet complete." She closed her eyes, and her breathing became even more shallow. "The child will be born when the winter ends," she continued, her voice barely audible. "The child will be born with power that neither of us possesses. The child will be born with the ability to reshape the world itself." She opened her white eyes and looked directly at him. "And the child will be the reason that everything changes." The vision continued, stretching forward into the future. Dimitri saw the child growing. He saw the child discovering powers that defied all natural law. He saw the child learning to manipulate time itself, to see into alternate realities, to reshape the very fabric of existence. But he also saw something else. He saw darkness. He saw a shadow rising in the north, a force so ancient and so powerful that it made even the Anshig tremble. He saw armies of creatures that had never been seen before in the history of the world. He saw a war that would consume everything, that would destroy kingdoms and civilizations, that would bring the world to the brink of annihilation. And at the center of it all, he saw a figure. It was a man, ancient, powerful, beautiful in the way that only the damned can be beautiful. He had eyes that glowed with a crimson fire, and his presence seemed to compress the very atmosphere around him. It was Katerina. Not Katerina as she had been in 1679, but Katerina as she had become, a being of pure power, pure will, pure intention. A being that had spent 347 years searching for Dimitri, waiting for him, planning her revenge, and she was coming. When the vision faded, Dimitri opened his eyes and looked at Serafina. "She is coming," he whispered. "Katerina is coming." Serafina nodded slowly. "Yes," she said softly. "She has been searching for you for 347 years. She has been waiting for the moment when you would be vulnerable, when you would be bound to another, when she could finally take her revenge." She paused, and her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "And she will arrive when the child is born." The months that followed were a blur of preparation and anticipation. Dimitri used his power to fortify the castle, to create defenses that would protect against even the most ancient and powerful of creatures. He gathered allies, warriors, healers, mages, creatures of the night who had grown tired of serving the old powers and were willing to fight for something new. But more than anything, he prepared himself. He understood now that the binding was not just a punishment, it was a preparation. It was a way of making him strong enough, wise enough, powerful enough to face what was coming. It was a way of transforming him from a predatory creature of the night into a man who could stand against the darkness and not be consumed by it. And through it all he felt Seraphine's presence, guiding him, protecting him, loving him. On the night of the winter solstice, as the darkness reached its deepest point, Seraphine's white eyes opened one final time. "It is time," she whispered. And Dimitri understood. It was time for the child to be born. It was time for everything to change. It was time for the true story to begin. The birth was unlike anything Dimitri had ever experienced. Seraphine's body, which had been suspended in that space between life and death for so long, began to transform. Light poured from her, a light so bright, so pure, that it seemed to come from the very core of her being. The light filled the chamber, filled the castle, filled the entire frozen realm, and in that light a child was born. The child was small, impossibly small, wrapped in a blanket of pure light. The child's eyes were swirling with both white and gold, a combination that had never existed before in the history of the world. The child's presence seemed to compress the very atmosphere around it, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Dimitri held the child in his arms, and he felt tears streaming down his face. "What is the child's name?" he asked, looking down at the small face. Seraphine's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of eternity. "The child's name is Hope," she said, "because that is what the child represents. Hope for a new world, hope for redemption, hope for a future where love transcends the boundaries of life and death, of mortality and immortality, of time itself." She closed her eyes, and her breathing became even more shallow. "And now," she continued, her voice dropping to barely a whisper, "I can finally rest." But as dawn broke over the frozen landscape, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows of the chamber, something unexpected happened. Seraphine's eyes opened one final time, but they were no longer white. They were gold, the same gold as Dimitri's eyes, the same gold as the child's eyes, the same gold as the eyes of the Anshig, who had walked the earth since before the concept of good and evil had been invented. She was no longer suspended between life and death. She was alive, truly, completely, irrevocably alive. "What?" Dimitri gasped, looking at her in astonishment. Serafina smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had finally achieved her purpose. "The child has given me back my life," she whispered. "The child has given me back my immortality. The child has given me back my power." She reached up and placed her small hand on his chest, directly over where his heart was beating. And now, she continued, her voice carrying the weight of eternity, we are ready for what comes next.